Now let us talk about the Marvel Age of Comics, as you can see here in a book written by Roy Thomas, who, by the way, before he became a writer for Marvel and then later became editor-in-chief, he was a fan and started a fanzine called Alter Ego back in the mid 60s that later developed into a high quality magazine and is still being published. And over the years, he has interviewed many people that have been involved in different time periods in comics history. Anyway, the Marvel Age of Comics. Now, that is not one of the official periodizations of comic book history like the Golden Age. It's kind of subjective, I suppose. You don't hear anyone but Marvel talking about the Marvel Age of Comics. You won't hear any other companies using that phrase. But when you say it, people who are familiar with comics and with the industry know what you're talking about. Well, let's do some clarification then, shall we? All right. Well, here are those official historical eras as you would find them if you were to Google those terms and see the dates associated with them. So more often than not, the Golden Age is considered to be from 1938 with the appearance of Superman until 1956 with the appearance of the modern Flash, which started the Silver Age, started in 1956, and is considered to have lasted until 1970. Then the next period is called the Bronze Age, basically the 70s up to the mid-80s. And then, if you are, depending on the source, either 1984 or 1985, then if you were to Google that and it were to take you to, say, the Wikipedia articles, for example, they would tell you the Bronze Age was followed by the Modern Age. Now, I find that a little problematic. It wasn't problematic in 1990, but it's a little problematic now because Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, on the average, about 15 years. But then to say the Modern Age is 36 years and counting, that doesn't seem that modern 36 years ago at this point in time. Also, I feel like there was a break, a cleaner break between the Golden Age and the Silver Age, and that there was a short period in between them. So I have a different periodization. So this is I've actually this is not all me. A couple of them are, but I would like to see things taken a little more, I guess, longue durée, to use a historical term, and look at the court durée a little bit as well. So I believe the Golden Age ended in 1950 with essentially the disappearance, the cancellation of all the timely / Marvel superheroes in 1949. I believe that 1950 to 1956 is what I want to refer to, and I think people should follow my example, as the EC age, because the stuff that was going on in 1952 and 1953 was vastly different from what was going on in 1942 and 1943. I mean, vastly different. So I say from the time that EC canceled all their other books and started their new trend titles in 1950, and then through the whole issue with the seduction of the innocent and the Senate subcommittee hearings and the establishment of the Comics Code Authority, to 1956, which is the first part of that year when Judgment Day was released for the second time, and that was it for EC Comics. They then, by the end of 1956, became Mad Magazine. So that is sort of an interregnum period between the beginning of the Silver Age, which does indeed, I'm down with the periodization of the Silver and the Bronze Age. Silver Age starting with the first appearance of the new Flash that opened up kind of a wave at DC of reintroducing and reimagining superheroes who had fallen by the wayside almost a decade earlier. Then to 1970, and then the Bronze Age usually is considered to be from roughly 1970 to, like I said, 84 or 85, depending on who you ask. Some people say 84 because that was the first big company-wide crossover that was from Marvel's Secret Wars. Some people would say 1985 with Crisis on Infinite Earths from DC, and I'll go with that one. But then to lump everything after that as modern is just kind of misleading. So I like to think there was another one of those interregnum periods, very similar to the EC Age, that I'm going to call the Dark Age. Now, of course, when we get to the narrative, we'll talk about this stuff. But essentially, beginning in 1986, with the conclusion of Crisis on Infinite Earths, there was, for a few years there, the emphasis from Marvel and DC and a lot of the independent comics was to be really, really dark and gritty and more violent and more focused on anti-heroes than heroes. Then I consider most of the 1990s to be what I call, and this is my invention here. Some other comics historians and critics would say that the Dark Age did in fact follow the Bronze Age, but I call this the Foil Age, and it starts in 1990 with Spider-Man #1 by Todd McFarlane, which was the first comic book to be in embossed, foil stamped covers with multiple different covers, glow in the dark, 3D, all designed to get people to buy all the different covers, all designed to get people to look at comics as an investment, which is what opened the way for the big comics speculation bubble of the 90s, and that's where it started. And then all through the first part of the 90s, like every other issue of every other comic book was a special issue that was die-cut, glow-in-the-dark, 3D hologram, whatever, until it all collapsed in 1997. I regard the period after that, and you know what, I've thought long and hard about what's an appropriate term, and I settled on the Pearl Age, and that's because, a pearl is something that is something beautiful, something new, produced by a massive irritation. And I feel like that's kind of what happened, okay? Because the comics market, the comics business imploded in 1997. Marvel declared bankruptcy. And the circulation of all the more popular comic books just declined precipitously. A bunch of comic stores went out of business. And at the same time, there was a renaissance of graphic novels. One shot, designed to be like one complete, discrete thing that were sold in bookstores. And at the same time, more and more comic book stories, multiple issues from the past, were being gathered together into bound volumes and also called graphic novels and sold in bookstores, so that the people that were still reading sequential art in that decade, the first decade of the 21st century, were not so much going to the comic shop and buying individual issues of a comic book as they were going to a regular bookstore and buying graphic novels. And it got to the point that the regular comic books from Marvel and DC and other companies started having story arcs with a beginning, middle, and an end that lasted 6, 7, or 8 issues, because that's what fits good in a bound collection or a graphic novel. So it changed the way stories were told. And then also during that period, you had both Marvel and DC with huge crossover events again, and rebooting and retconning their universes, in some cases over and over again within just a short period of time, trying desperately to get sales. So there was a transition in how comic books and sequential art reached audiences. Okay? So this last term, the Blue Age, that is not of my design. That is from a comics scholar, Adrian Rescha, who gave a paper on this at the very first Comics Studies Society conference at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign in 2018, and shortly afterward in a peer-reviewed paper. So she came up with this term, and I think we should use it from about 2010 forward, and that is essentially the digital age. Beginning with that period, both the creation and the marketing and the consumption of comic books was done not primarily in paper at all, but online in digital form. So I think that list is a more nuanced one than the standard one that you see. So the Marvel age of comics essentially would then be about the last 2/3 of the Silver Age. Okay, so they come into the Silver Age about a third of the way in 1961. First third of the Silver Age, all DC, right? As they have rebooted and re-energized the very concept of the superhero. And at that same time, Marvel struggling along. They went through all those issues we talked about earlier with distribution and so forth, and having to let a bunch of people go. And essentially they're doing, a few westerns, a couple of romance comics, and a whole bunch of monsters by the late 50s. So the Marvel age is when, throughout most of the 1960s, Marvel Comics flourished. Marvel Comics was reborn and became a cultural phenomenon and achieved a popularity that no one had seen since Action Comics #1 in 1938 had changed everything about the new industry known as comic books. And you could say the Marvel age extended through the 1970s as well, because by the 1970s, Marvel had surpassed DC as the #1 selling company, and that was true all the way well into the 1980s. So we're going to look now at how that got started. And it started specifically, they have 1961 here as the start point. Roy Thomas does, and so does everyone else, because that was the year Fantastic Four #1 came out. November 1961, the November cover date, anyhow, by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And that's how Stan Lee and Jack Kirby looked in 1961. Stan didn't have a mustache, and his hairline had receded pretty far back there. Just real briefly, here's how they looked in 1967. Jack Kirby had not changed, and in fact seems to have barely changed since World War II. And Stan got a little more hip because it's the 60s, grew a beard, and the sudden success of Marvel enabled him to buy a toupee, apparently. All right. Well, Fantastic Four #1. The story of the launch of that comic book, which would be the beginning of the Marvel explosion, actually starts at DC Comics with the introduction of the Justice League of America around 1960. So There is a story that there's no way to tell if it's true. It's now believed it might be apocryphal. It might be something Martin Goodman made up or Stan Lee made up. But the story was that Martin Goodman was golfing with Erwin Donenfeld, who proceeded to just brag and brag and brag about how many sales they were getting for this new Justice League comic, and that ticked Martin Goodman off. Now, we don't know if that happened or not, but we do know that Martin Goodman became aware of the success of the Justice League. And so he contacted Stan Lee, who was the editor of the Marvel line and writer of most of the books, and said, National is killing us with this Justice League. It's extremely successful. We need to do the same thing. We need a team of superheroes. So get me one. Well, that's kind of a tall order because Marvel didn't have any superheroes. I mean, they had from back in the 1940s, but they'd been canceled for well over a decade. So Stan Lee is given the task of coming up with something. Now, according to one story that Stan Lee has told multiple times, at that time he was feeling kind of, feeling sort of, I guess you could say, a bit of a midlife crisis. He'd spent all this time, at this point, he had spent 20 years in comic books, more than 20 years, 22 years in comic books, thought he was going to be the great American novelist, and basically was writing the same thing over and over again, whatever Martin Goodman thought would sell, because something else similar was selling. And he was bored of just jumping on the bandwagon and shifting everything over to whatever the fad this week was. And he was kind of discouraged, and this is according to his story. And his wife convinced him to give it a try. And since he didn't have anything to lose, because he was thinking about quitting, since he had nothing to lose, why not go ahead and do it the way you want to do it, instead of the way the publisher wants to do it, instead of the way the market is showing what's popular. Do what you want to do and just see what happens. So he wrote up a synopsis, according to Stan Lee. He wrote up a synopsis for what he wanted, gave it to Jack Kirby, who filled in most of the details and designed, really, the characters, and drew the whole thing. And then Stan Lee went back and added all the dialogue and all the captions, and came up with the Fantastic Four. Well, what was different about the Fantastic Four? Well, here's just a few things that were different. They didn't have secret identities. They didn't wear masks. The public knew who they really were. Another thing that was different about them is that, unlike the Justice Society or the Justice League, they weren't a bunch of independent superheroes who came together to form an alliance. They were essentially a family, in a way. Well, kind of. Well, okay, so the top picture there, left to right, just in case you don't know your Fantastic Four. You've got Reed Richards, alias Mr. Fantastic. Humility was not one of his virtues. His fiancée, later his wife, Sue Storm, alias the Invisible Girl. And as we discussed earlier, it would take a quarter of a century for her to get promoted to the Invisible Woman. Mr. Fantastic, by the way, is a stretchy guy like Plastic Man. The Invisible Girl can turn invisible and project invisible force fields, which is something that develops over time. Then you've got Ben Grimm, alias The Thing, who was Reed Richards' best friend and his roommate in college. And then on the end there, Johnny Storm, alias the Human Torch, that is the new Human Torch. Johnny Storm being the kid brother, the teenage brother, younger brother of Sue Storm. And the power of the Human Torch is he's a human torch. All right, so if you don't know the story, why Reed Richards had invented this spaceship that he wanted to test, and the government wouldn't give him clearance to launch it. So, with the help of his fiancée and her kid brother, who tagged along, and his best friend Ben Grimm, who was a professional test pilot, they sneak in and get the ship and launch it, but it's not properly shielded, and they are bombarded by cosmic rays, and they try to get back to Earth, and the ship kind of crashes, but they survive. But the radiation has given them these wacky, weird powers. Okay, and so then they decide to use those powers for good, like good superheroes do. So that's another thing that's different about them. They all got their superpowers at the same time. So they were a unit before they became superheroes. So that stuff is all different. Some other things that were different about them, well, you'll notice I have one big happy dysfunctional family. This is the real difference. Those things are cosmetic that we talked about already. The real difference is they acted like real people. Well, I mean, how can you act like a real person when you're a human torch? Well, here's what I mean by that. Before Fantastic Four #1, for the most part, superheroes in comic books basically all had the same personality, which is they had no personality. So you take the 7 original members of the Justice League, and you account for some differences from Wonder Woman, though not many by that time, because it was a long time since the William Moulton Marsh days. For the most part, other than having different catchphrases, all 7 of those characters acted the same, talked the same, and essentially any dialogue that you had was completely interchangeable. Any one of them could have said it, because it's the sort of thing all of them would have said, using the sort of language all of them would have used. So, it's just this uniformity. And even the secret identities of those superheroes and superheroes for 20 years, like, Clark Kent as Superman, Bruce Wayne as Batman, Hal Jordan as Green Lantern. The secret identities were mostly just there to prop up the superhero identity, right? They didn't have much of a life beyond catching this week's bad guy. The Fantastic Four was very different. They had very distinct personalities and distinct ways of talking. For example, Ben Grimm, and there he is, there pointing his finger at Reed Richards. That's how he looked before he got turned into the big orange lumpy rock thing. He frequently spoke in slang, which is really not to indicate he was uneducated. The character has a college education, but he's a person of the streets, and spoke as such. Reed Richards is brilliant, a brilliant scientist and inventor, but he's also kind of distant. He generally seems to have it together, but he does have a certain degree of arrogance to him. Sue probably has the least defined personality of any of them. She has the personality of practically all female characters of the early 60s, which is to say that she was this generally submissive kind of housewife character. Although, she did get out there and fight. Johnny Storm, the teenager, acted like a teenager, which is to say that he was just annoying as heck. And everyone lost patience with him a lot because he was kind of loudmouthed, and he was immature, and he had tantrums, and he and the Thing were constantly at each other. The Thing had kind of a crush on Sue Storm and was jealous of his best friend Reed. The Thing, once he became the Thing, it got worse. Things got worse because now he's this monstrous looking person. Everyone else has these cool powers they can control, but he's just a monster forever. He feels like Reed Richards is sort of has taken advantage of him and got him stuck in this situation. Johnny's always complaining that he doesn't have money for sports cars or whatever and threatening to quit. And so they're just bickering and fighting one another all the time, the way that families actually do in real life. You've never seen people act like this in a comic book. You've never seen people have distinct personalities or personal problems. Well, Ben Grimm's got a huge personal problem. He's an ugly monster. But there are other personal problems that arise as well. Like every once in a while, they will have financial issues. Like on one occasion, they were going to get evicted from their headquarters because Reed Richards had been playing the stock market and it went badly. And so then they got to raise some money. So things like that, not the sort of stuff that you were used to seeing. Maybe some of this stuff in a romance comic, but not even really there, right? Because there, all the problems were just sort of one track kind of problems. By the way, Ben Grimm, the Thing, was a cigar chomping, tough talking World War II veteran, just like Jack Kirby. And in fact, kind of a long running comedy subplot in the Fantastic Four is Ben Grimm's lifelong sort of enmity with a street gang called the Yancey Street Gang that are always pulling pranks on him and making fun of him. And his relationship with them extends all the way back to when he was a teenager. Jack Kirby, when he was a teenager, was in a Jewish street gang called the Delancey Street Gang. So what I'm saying is that the character of Ben Grimm has a lot of Jack Kirby in him. Now, they could not in the 1960s explicitly make him Jewish for fear of losing readers. In fact, pretty much the only time you saw Jewish characters in comic books until probably the 1980s was if they were victims of the Holocaust. But in a later era, Marvel was able to explicitly show that Ben Grimm is indeed a devout Jew. So, like I said, a lot of Jack Kirby. Now, another character whose fate is closely entwined with the Fantastic Four is their arch enemy, Doctor Doom, whose name is Doctor Doom, Victor Von Doom, from the imaginary country, the fictional country of Latveria. He is, in fact, the monarch of Latveria. Although he came from humble beginnings, his mother was a member of the Roma, a minority group referred to not complimentary as gypsies. But he overthrew the government and established himself as king of Latveria, dresses in this heavy armor and has scientific brilliance as well as knowledge of magic and sorcery. Now, he had known Reed Richards and Ben Grimm since they were in college, because he had been an exchange student at Empire State University. Eventually, they settled on, and he and Reed Richards had been friends in a way, frenemies They were rivals. And on one occasion, by the way, Doctor Doom, even more arrogant than Reed Richards. On one occasion, Doom was working on an experiment, an invention, and Reed Richards came along and corrected his math. Oh, you made a little mistake there, which really ticked him off, and so therefore he refused to change it because he couldn't possibly be wrong. And then he started the thing up, and it blew up, and horribly disfigured him, damaged his face, which is why he wears this iron mask and hates Reed Richards because he believes it's all, he blames it all on him. He thinks he tampered with it or whatever. Like I say, very arrogant, can't stand the idea of anyone being smarter than him. Jack Kirby had said that although they didn't show it in those early issues, that in reality the scar wasn't really that bad. But Doctor Doom was such a perfectionist that any blemish was unendurable. Therefore, he covered his face forever. Later on, in John Byrne's celebrated run on Fantastic Four in the 1980s, he retold that story and revealed that Doom was in such a hurry to seal his face away forever, he didn't let the mask cool off. And when he put it on, it actually did destroy his face. Anyway, as a dictatorial monarch, Doom has kind of a complicated relationship with his people, the people of Latveria, because some of them have some loyalty to him because he solved a lot of their problems, except for the fact that he was a dictator, right? And so his character, A, is obsessed with trying to find a way to bring back his dead mother, whose spirit has been banished to hell. And so there's the magical part. He's trying to rescue his mother's spirit. And also, he is trying to defend his homeland, which admittedly he rules with an iron hand, and extend that over the whole world because he wants to solve their problems, and he knows better than they do, which is definitely, definitely not an advisable position to take in life. But it brings some shades, at least a little bit of shades of gray compared to villains in previous eras who were evil because they were evil and wanted to rule the world because they were evil. Well, Dr. Doom actually is evil, but he actually thinks, and from his perspective, he thinks he is the hero of the story. So that's another thing that, although that wasn't as firmly established in the early Stan Lee and Jack Kirby days, it gradually unfolds. And that's something else that makes the Fantastic Four different. And Lee and Kirby's approach to the characters is that the good guys aren't super, super good. They make mistakes and they have failings. And even the bad guys aren't necessarily totally, completely, wickedly bad. They may be misguided and they may even be evil. But there's some shades of gray in there. By the way, I'd just like to say that, at least as of this time, 2020, Doctor Doom has never been done justice at the movies. There have been 3 Fantastic Four movies from 20th Century Fox, or Fox Studios, as I think it's now called. So none of these were done by Marvel Studios. And there were 2 different takes on the Fantastic Four and Doctor Doom, but woefully inadequate portrayals of the good Doctor. For one thing, in both the sets of movies, they tried to give him these weird superpowers, which he doesn't have. And the main thing is that they just don't capture the gravitas of Doctor Doom. I mean, he's a bad guy, and he's evil, but he has a certain presence, kind of like Darth Vader. A lot like Darth Vader, sort of a combination of Darth Vader and Christopher Lee as Dracula. A lot of, class, I guess you could say, and a certain nobility and a certain tragic element to the character, which is the same reason that so many people fell in love with, so many women fell in love with Barnabas Collins the vampire in Dark Shadows, even though he was evil, because he had this tragic past, right? So they've just not captured that Darth Vader-like quality, at least so far, in Doctor Doom. I'd also like to direct your attention to this comic book from DC that came out in 1957 by Jack Kirby, possibly co-created with Joe Simon, Challengers of the Unknown, which was a group of 4 adventurers who wore matching outfits, one of whom was a professor, and the other was a war hero and fearless jet pilot. So Challengers of the Unknown in some ways was a prototype for the Fantastic Four and demonstrates just how much influence Jack Kirby had on how the characters turned out. Stan Lee obviously had a lot of influence as well, because his dialogue is what helped to establish their personalities. So it is, I think it is accurate to say that the Fantastic Four were co-created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Some fans still argue over which one really did it, or which one did most of it, and the other rode on their coattails. I think it was a team effort. Immediately after the first issue came out, they started getting response from the fans. They started getting letters, and it seems that this new approach to superheroes that Lee and Kirby had taken was really striking a chord. Also really struck a chord in sales. So yeah, lots of letters. They were averaging about a letter a day for the company before Fantastic Four came out, but pretty quickly after the first issues came out, they were getting 500 letters for Fantastic Four alone. Now, you do have to admit that some of the letters, like this one over on the bottom right from S. Brodsky of Brooklyn, that's Saul Brodsky, who was the production manager at Marvel. And also, apparently, Stan Lee wrote a lot of the letters. But still, nonetheless, there were an astonishingly large amount of letters that Stan Lee and company kind of augmented. But when we were talking earlier about the volume of mail in the 1960s and how voluminous it was, to the extent that Flo Steinberg was, who was having to answer it all, was burned out, and when she didn't get a much deserved raise, didn't do it anymore. So this is the beginning of something. Now, Jack Kirby's story of how it all started has him really pushing for superheroes for a good while before this, and really pushing for his take on how they should be done. And I think that there's probably an element of truth to both that and Stan Lee's story. I think that the truth is kind of in the middle. But Kirby had a lot of other ideas, and this was just the tip of the iceberg. It was successful, so Lee and Kirby and a couple of other artists who were working at Marvel started putting those ideas into action.